Hello, I'm William Blake. I was writing in the late 1700s, which was a time where everything was changing in England. I lived in London for my whole life. I saw the factories, the chimneys come up, and the Industrial Revolution move almost everyone out of the countryside into London, which led to loads of overpopulation, lots of strict new rules, and a very strict government who were clamping down on all kind of rights and freedoms. I was a rebel. I was well ahead of my time. I disagreed with slavery. I believed in freedom. I hated school. I hated any kind of rule that would restrict mankind. And that all comes across in my poem, London. Let's take a look, shall we?
Ready when you are.
I've got very kind of modern attitudes, haven't I, really? Let's do a few more little bits like that, is that okay? I was part of the Romanticism movement. That's really good. I was part of the Romanticism movement. I was a romantic poet with a capital R. And that meant I was very interested in the place of nature and the individual in life, and much less concerned with rules and things like that. So London can be a great comparison to loads of other poems which are complaining about the power held by big organisations and individuals, you know, anyone really. I wasn't that popular in my own lifetime. I only sold 12 copies of my poetry collection, would you believe? But now everybody loves me. I seem to just fit into like modern life better. Right, let's take a look at London then. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry every blackening church appalls, and hapless soldiers' sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Ooh, okay, so this is one of those poems that definitely has some key moments in, some key messages. But let's have a look at the overall structure first of all. I wander. Okay, so we've got this first person thing going on. So in that it's quite different from, say, Owen, who very much talks about we and our in his poem Exposure. He's a man of the people, but William Blake is doing the kind of opposite here. He's structuring this as like a tour through London, and how kind of crap it's become, really, how problematic and how difficult the Industrial Revolution has made it. So remember, you need to talk about context here and understand that he is looking around this city that has changed almost beyond all recognition in the time that he's been writing. Okay, so he wanders through and he's taking a kind of tour through his home city, the city he lived in his entire life. And he wanders through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames just flow. Now you can't fail to notice the repetition of chartered there. I'm going to make lots of comparisons to other poems because that's what this is all about after all. Every single thing needs to be as part of a comparison, and repetition is probably the technique that comes up most over all the poems. You've got it in Owen, in Charge of the Light Brigade, in Ozymandias. You've got a repetition in almost every poem here. And here he chooses to repeat the word chartered, which is like a kind of structure, an organised structure that's been applied to something. Mapped out is a chartering. Almost like, you know, on a map where you see the Thames in London flowing through the city. Almost as if mankind has kind of told the river where to flow, or at least mapped it and structured it. Now Blake doesn't like that. So he's another one of these poems who is repeating something he doesn't like to protest against it. Blake is all about freedom, and he looks at the way that we've structured and mapped out every single tiny bit as being a real negative, a real problem for mankind. Okay, so he goes through this key river of London, and he notices in every face I meet, note he says every face, literally everybody is unhappy in London. Marks of weakness and marks of woe. So there's sadness, about the way these people look, but there's also weakness as well, which suggests that perhaps it is their fault to some extent. Okay, now that's quite a difference from, say, Ozymandias, where it's very much about the ruler's fault. Blake is introducing the concept that it might be the people's fault a little bit here as well. We get a very simple rhyme scheme, very simple structure as we carry on. We've got man, fear, ban here. We've got this A, B thing that goes through. Blake did that a lot. He was not interested in messing around with his structure. He just wanted to make his points very clearly. And again, if you were writing a poem, you'd say that in some ways this isn't very good because of so much repetition and using the same words. But he makes his point really clearly and he builds up to it. And this, for me, is probably the key line of the whole poem. In every cry of every man, in every blah blah blah, everybody feels it. The mind forged manacles. Now this is an idea that's very similar to Marxism. So those of you going for a 7, 8 or 9, have a little think about here. So mind, so inside your own brain, forged, created. The mind created manacles, which are like handcuffs in modern day, or chains, okay? So he is saying that we are in chains inside our minds. We think we're free, but we're not. We've got these structures that are applied to us, and this is kind of true. I'm kind of trapped in this job because of my need to earn some money, aren't I really? I mean, I'm not really, but I can't just quit and walk off because my mind tells me I can't do. You know what I mean? I gotta pay for my house, I gotta pay for my food and stuff like that. So he says that in London, everybody's stuck because they feel stuck inside their brains. And he goes on to talk about what the effects of being stuck in this city and stuck in this system. You know, Blake is trying to kind of sock it to the man here, really. So in that, it shows a good comparison to, say, My Last Duchess, because they're about what power can do to people. Ozymandias, again, great comparison there. And just how the individual's lives are affected by this stuff. This is a pretty important stanza too here as well. The chimney sweeper, you'll know that from like Dickens and stuff about like what it was like for boys cleaning the chimneys. Lots of them died and burnt alive and stuff like that. It was hideous in Victorian London. I was part of the Romanticism movement. I was a romantic poet with a capital R. And that meant I was very interested in the place of nature and the individual in life, and much less concerned with rules and things like that. Every blackening church applause. So the chimney sweeper's cry seems to blacken the church. So there's a little subtle dig at religion there. Blake was a massive fan of God, but he hated organised religion. He was against it. Is this a little bit like our love of God seems dying from exposure? Yeah, a little bit of kind of like anti-church message here. And notice also that the hapless soldier's sigh, he doesn't specify exactly what conflict, he's just talking generally about what happens here with soldiers. Their sigh runs in blood down palace walls. That's a really lovely piece of visual imagery that turns this sigh into blood. Blake did that kind of stuff quite a lot, these unusual metaphorical systems, but suggesting that the palace, so the king, who at the time was King George III, and the government as well, this Tory government at the time that were very, very strict, they are somehow responsible for the soldiers bleeding. Now that's just like any of your war poems as well, from A Charge of the Light Brigade that puts the generals in charge of that, you know, creating the blood. The blood is kind of on their hands, so to speak, kind of Macbeth style. And then he gets to his fourth stanza and he really ups it a gear in terms of his structure by saying, but most, so all that terrible stuff, but most, even worse than that, is as he walks through the midnight streets, kind of very Jekyll and Hyde here at the moment, how the youthful harlots as prostitutes curse, blast the newborn infant's tear. So the prostitute's curse at the moment is kind of like the children that they didn't really want to have, but kind of a side effect of their unfortunate job, is blighting with plagues. Notice a kind of religious Old Testament style imagery here. The marriage hearse. Now that's an interesting phrase to end it with as well. We associate a hearse normally with a funeral. Yeah, carrying a coffin to a funeral. But this is the marriage hearse. So you look at this oxymoron here, or the kind of juxtaposition really, the two opposite or contrasting things together. You don't get that a huge amount in the collection, but it's interesting that Blake is protesting in this way. He says that the prostitution, and by extension the way that everybody's kind of living in London at the moment, is ruining everything. It's like ruining marriage as well. These kids, I guess, you know, the men going off and seeing the prostitutes and having these kind of children as a consequence of that is casting a plague on marriage, and that the marriage is kind of dead from the very start. There's a lot of really interesting imagery in there as well. So make no mistake that this is a protest against lots of different things, against power, against the church, against the state as well, by talking about the palace here, against the king and that kind of thing as well. So it's a very similar kind of protest, but it does things in a very different way. Your examiner would be really pleased if this poem comes up and you'd find a lot of differences in terms of how this same message is presented differently as you go through, as well as some of those similarities too. I hope that helps. So London can be a great comparison to loads of other poems which are complaining about the power held by big organisations and individuals, you know, anyone really.